Skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows shimmered with a million electric stars, none of which offered him any warmth. He loosened his tie, the silk slipping through his fingers, and exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding since the morning board meeting. Success was supposed to feel like this, vast, unassailable, perfect. Yet, as he looked around the cavernous living room, furnished with pieces that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, he felt only a chilling draft sweeping through his soul. The air conditioning was set to a perfect temperature, yet he shivered, pulling his suit jacket tighter around his shoulders as if trying to hold himself together. He walked toward the kitchen, a space of stainless steel and polished granite that had never smelled of home-cooked meals. The refrigerator hummed, the only sign of life in the structure. He opened it, staring at the organized rows of water bottles and prepared meals from a private chef, none of which appealed to him. He closed the door without taking anything. Hunger was a physical sensation he could ignore, much like the loneliness that had become his constant companion. He turned back toward the hallway, his footsteps slowing as he passed the closed door of the guest wing. It had been 5 years since anyone had slept in those rooms. 5 years since the house had felt like a home and not merely a showcase of his net worth. The dust motes dancing in the security light beams seemed to mock him, settling on surfaces that no one touched. His phone buzzed on the console table, the screen lighting up the dim hallway. It was Marcus, his executive assistant. Arthur hesitated before answering, knowing that whatever news waited on the other end would likely be about mergers, acquisitions, or schedules. He swiped the screen and lifted the device to his ear, his voice barely above a whisper. "Arthur." Marcus's voice was crisp, efficient, yet laced with a familiarity that bordered on concern. "I know the time. I wouldn't call unless it was necessary." "It's always necessary, Marcus," Arthur replied, his voice rough with fatigue. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the cool plaster soothe the heat of his frustration. "What is it?" "The invitation for the charity gala next weekend. The Sterling Foundation. They need a confirmation by tomorrow morning. It's the event of the year, Arthur. Everyone will be there. Investors, partners. It's where you close the Skyline deal." Arthur opened his eyes, staring at an abstract painting on the opposite wall. It was bold and colorful, chosen by an interior designer who claimed it represented vitality. To Arthur, it looked like chaos frozen in time. "I told you I wasn't interested in social gatherings. Send a representative. Donate the money. Just keep my name off the attendance list." "It doesn't work that way, sir," Marcus insisted, his tone softening, dropping the professional facade for a moment. "Your presence is the currency here. But there is something else. Something you should know." A ripple of unease went through Arthur, straightening his spine. Marcus rarely hedged his words. He was a man of direct facts and figures. "What is it? Is there a problem with the merger?" "No, the business is solid. It's personal. There are rumors that, well, it doesn't matter. Just go to the gala. Please. For the business. But also for yourself. You've been in that house too long. You're fading, Arthur." Arthur pulled the phone away from his ear, looking at the black screen as if it held answers he was too afraid to read. "For myself? There is nothing out there for me, Marcus. Everything I built is in these files and these walls. I don't need a party to validate my existence." "You don't know that," Marcus said quietly, the line crackling slightly with the distance between them. "Sometimes the things we think we lost are just waiting for us to look in the right place. Don't make me send the car to drag you out." The line went dead before Arthur could respond. The silence rushed back in, louder than before, filling the vacuum left by the voice. Arthur slipped the phone into his pocket and walked toward his study. The room was lined with books he hadn't read and awards he hadn't celebrated. Trophies for Developer of the Year gathered dust next to first-edition novels he never opened. He sat in the leather chair behind the massive desk, the material cold against his hands, biting into his skin. He opened the top drawer, pushing aside contracts and pen sets until his fingers brushed against the edge of a framed photograph turned face down. He hadn't looked at it in years. It was a ritual of self-punishment, he supposed. To know it was there, but not to see it. To acknowledge the loss without confronting the pain. Tonight, however, the silence of the house demanded something more. The words Marcus had spoken echoed in the empty room, waiting for us to look. He picked up the frame and turned it over. The image was slightly faded now, the colors softening with time. It was him and Elena, standing on a beach during a weekend getaway, years before the towers and the towers of paperwork. They were smiling, Not the polished smiles for the cameras, but real, unguarded expressions of joy. Elena's hair was windblown, her eyes crinkled at the corners. She looked happy. He looked happy. They looked like people who believed in a future together. A sharp pain tightened in his chest, a physical ache. That had nothing to do with health and everything to do with memory. He traced the glass over her face with his thumb, careful not to press too hard. How had it come to this? The divorce had been swift, legal, and brutally efficient. She had left without a fight, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and a silence that spoke louder than any accusation. He had told himself she hadn't loved him enough to stay. He had told himself that his ambition was the only thing that mattered because it was the only thing that stayed. But looking at the photo, the narrative he had built for 5 years began to crack. He remembered the day she left. It wasn't a stormy day. It was sunny. That made it worse. The contrast between the bright weather and the dark ending. She didn't yell. She just looked at him with eyes that had gone quiet. That quietness was what haunted him. It wasn't anger, it was resignation. She had given up on him before she walked out the door. He had been signing papers then. He hadn't even looked up. "I'll be home late," he had said. She had replied, "Don't bother." He thought she meant don't bother coming home late. She meant don't bother coming home at all. "Elena," he whispered into the empty room. The name felt foreign on his tongue, like a word from a language he had forgotten how to speak. It tasted like salt and regret. He placed the photo back in the drawer, but this time, he didn't turn it face down. He left it there, facing up, a small act of defiance against the oblivion he had been living in. He stood up and walked back to the window. The city was still awake, pulsing with life. Somewhere out there, millions of people were interacting, loving, fighting, living. And he was here, a king in a castle of dust. The invitation Marcus mentioned lay on the corner of his desk. He hadn't noticed it earlier. It was heavy cardstock, cream-colored with gold embossing. He picked it up, feeling the texture. The Sterling Foundation Gala. He knew the Sterling family. They were old money connected. But why did Marcus sound so insistent? Why the hesitation on the phone? What rumors could possibly exist about a man who lived in such isolation? A sense of anticipation began to brew in his gut, mixing with the dread. It was the feeling of standing on the edge of a diving board, knowing you have to jump but not knowing how deep the water is. He walked back to the foyer, the invitation still in his hand. The house seemed to watch him, the shadows lengthening as the moon moved across the sky. He thought about refusing. He thought about staying safe in his routine of work and solitude. But the image of Elena's smile in the photograph lingered in his mind, superimposed over the cold marble of his floor. He realized that his safety was an illusion. He was already drowning. The water was just rising slowly. He walked to the front door and opened it. The night air rushed in, cool and fresh, carrying the scent of rain and distant traffic. He stepped out onto the porch, looking out at the driveway where his car waited. He realized then that he was waiting for something. Not a business deal, not a merger. He was waiting for a change. He didn't know what it was, but the stillness of the last 5 years was finally breaking. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was pregnant with possibility. He looked down at the invitation again. Next weekend. 7 days. It felt like an eternity and a second all at once. He turned back to the house, closing the door behind him, locking out the night but keeping the feeling of the air on his skin. He would go. Not for the investors. Not for the Skyline deal. He would go because staying here, in this museum of his own making, was becoming impossible. As he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, the house creaked softly, settling into the night. He passed the mirror in the hallway and paused. The man looking back at him was successful, powerful, and wealthy. But his eyes were tired. They were the eyes of a man who had won the game only to realize he was playing alone. He touched the glass, a fleeting connection with his own reflection. "Next week," he said to the mirror. It was a promise. He entered his bedroom, a vast space with a bed that seemed too large for one person. He sat on the edge, the invitation on the nightstand. He didn't turn on the lights. He let the darkness wrap around him, finding a strange comfort in it now. It was no longer just emptiness. It was a canvas. Something was coming. He could feel it in the way the air shifted, in the way his heart beat slightly faster than usual. He lay back, staring at the ceiling, the details of the molding blurring in the dark. Sleep did not come easily. His mind raced through scenarios, meetings, handshakes. But beneath the business thoughts, there was a current of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope, fear, regret. They swirled together, a storm behind his ribs. He thought about the rumors Marcus hinted at. What could be out there that would require his presence so urgently? Was it a threat? An opportunity? Or was it something personal? The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. What if it was her? No, that was impossible. She had vanished from his world completely. She had made sure of that. But the universe had a way of circling back, of tying loose ends. He closed his eyes, trying to suppress the thought, but it took root. If she were there, what would he say? Would she look at him with anger? With indifference? Or would she look at him with the same sadness he felt now? The night stretched on, the hours marking themselves by the changing light of the street lamps outside. Arthur drifted in and out of sleep, dreaming of corridors that never ended and doors that wouldn't open. When morning finally broke, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, he was already awake. He sat up, the sheets pooling around his waist. The invitation was still there, real and solid. He stood up and walked to the window again. The city was waking up. People were going to work, dropping children at school, buying coffee. Life was moving forward. He had been standing still. Today, he would call Marcus. Today, he would confirm his attendance. The decision was made, not with the logic of a businessman, but with the intuition of a man who knows he is running out of time to fix what was broken. The morning light revealed the dust on the shelves. He usually ignored it. Today, he saw it. It was evidence of time passing without change. He wiped a spot on the desk with his sleeve. A small, clean circle in the gray. A metaphor. He could clean this mess. He could start again. He went downstairs to make coffee, the ritual familiar and grounding. As the machine gurgled, filling the silent kitchen with the aroma of roasted beans, he looked at the photo on the counter, a duplicate of the one in the drawer. He had kept it there for years, hidden behind a vase. Now he moved the vase. He let the photo stand openly. It was a small step, but in the landscape of his life, it was a mountain moved. He took the cup and walked back to the study. He picked up the phone. His finger hovered over Marcus's contact. He took a deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, sharp and cold. He pressed the call button. "Marcus," he said when the line connected, his voice steadier than it had been all night. "Send the confirmation." "I'll be there." "Understood, Arthur," Marcus replied, though his voice betrayed a hint of surprise. "I'll arrange the car." "No," Arthur said, looking at the photo of Elena, the sunlight finally catching the frame. "I'll drive myself. I need to think." He hung up before Marcus could respond. He sat back in the chair, the coffee steaming in front of him. The die was cast. The isolation was over. Whether it led to redemption or further heartbreak, he didn't know. But as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the light beams, Arthur felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. He felt alive. The silence of the mansion was no longer a tomb. It was a waiting room. And away from the warm study, and back into the cold corridors of memory. The decision to attend the gala had opened a door he had welded shut half a decade ago. And now the draft from that opening chilled him despite the morning sun. He took a sip of the coffee, the bitterness grounding him, but the taste only served to unlock the vault of the past. It was impossible to move forward without understanding exactly where he had stumbled, and so, sitting in the quiet of his mansion, Arthur allowed himself to fall backward into the timeline he had tried so hard to erase. The memory arrived not as a dream, but with the sharp clarity of a wound reopened. It was 5 years ago, almost to the day. He remembered the office differently then. It had felt like a command center, a place of power rather than isolation. He had been closing the merger that would solidify his empire, the Skyline deal that now seemed so hollow. His phone had buzzed constantly on the desk, a persistent insect noise that he had learned to ignore. He recalled looking at the screen then, seeing Elena's name flash across the display. He remembered the irritation that had flared in his chest. Why is she calling during negotiations? He had thought, doesn't she understand what is at stake? He had silenced the phone, flipping it face down on the mahogany surface. That small motion, that simple act of prioritizing business over her voice, echoed in his mind now with the volume of a gunshot. He had told himself it was temporary. He had told himself she would understand once the deal was signed, once the money was secure, once he could give her the life she deserved. He remembered driving home that night. The rain had been lashing against the windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the storm. The city lights blurred into streaks of neon gold and red, reflecting his own fractured focus. He had rehearsed what he would say to her. I'm sorry I missed your calls. It's done now. We're secure. He had imagined her smile, the relief in her eyes. He had convinced himself that his exhaustion was a sacrifice for their future. When he pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. Not the peaceful dark of sleep, but the heavy, empty dark of absence. He remembered the key turning in the lock, the sound echoing too loudly in the foyer. He had called her name, expecting her to come down the stairs, perhaps wearing that soft robe she liked. But there was no answer. The silence was different then. It wasn't the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of a vacated one. Arthur walked through the memory as if he were walking through the house again. He had checked the bedroom first. The bed was made, perfectly smooth, untouched. The closet door was open. Half of her clothes were gone. Not all of them, just the essentials. The things she loved were left behind. He remembered standing in the center of the room, the cold air from the open window chilling his sweat-dampened shirt. There was no note on the pillow, no letter on the dresser, just a void where her presence used to be. He had felt a surge of anger then, hot and defensive. She left me, he had told himself. After everything I built. After everything I did for us. He had paced the floor, his footsteps heavy, trying to rationalize the irrational. He had convinced himself that she had found someone else, or that she simply couldn't handle the pressure of his life. He had refused to consider that the pressure was coming from him. The next few weeks were a blur of legal letters and cold negotiations. He remembered the lawyer's office vividly. It smelled of old paper and lemon polish. The lawyer, a man with silver hair and eyes like glass, had slid the papers across the desk. "She isn't asking for much, Arthur," the lawyer had said, his voice devoid of emotion. "She wants the divorce finalized quickly. She's waiving most of the settlement." Arthur had scoffed at that. He remembered leaning back in the leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "It's a trick," he had said, his voice hard. "She wants to make me look like the villain. She wants the public sympathy." The lawyer had shrugged, tapping a pen against the file. "Or she just wants out. Sign here." Arthur had signed. He remembered the feel of the pen, the scratch of the nib on the thick paper. Each signature felt like a nail in a coffin. He had told himself he didn't care. He had told himself he was better off without someone who would abandon him at the peak of his success. But as he left the office that day, the rain had started again, and he had stood under the awning, watching the drops hit the pavement. He had felt a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of money could fill. He had gone home to the mansion, and for the first time, the silence had greeted him like an old enemy. He had cut off communication immediately. He blocked her number. He instructed his staff not to forward any messages. He built a wall of indifference, brick by brick, telling himself it was protection. If he didn't feel, he couldn't be hurt. If he didn't know, he couldn't miss her. Back in the present, the coffee in his cup had gone cold. Arthur set it down on the coaster with a trembling hand. The memory faded, leaving him breathless in the morning light. He looked at the photograph on the desk again. Elena's smile seemed to mock his narrative. She waiving the settlement? His mind latched onto that detail, one he had suppressed for years. Why would she leave everything behind if she was just greedy? Why would she vanish without a fight if she didn't care? The story he had told himself for 5 years, the story of the abandoned husband, the victim of a wife who couldn't handle his ambition, began to crumble under the weight of scrutiny. He had painted her as the villain to protect himself from the truth, that he had been the one who was absent. He had been the one who silenced the phone. He had been the one who came home too late. A sense of dread began to mix with the regret. If he had been wrong about why she left, what else had he been wrong about? The rumors Marcus had hinted at on the phone nagged at the edges of his thoughts. Sometimes the things we think we lost are just waiting for us to look. The words echoed in the study. Arthur stood up and walked to the window again. The city looked different now. It wasn't just a landscape of assets and opportunities. It was a place where people lived, where secrets were kept, where lives continued without him. He thought about the gala. He thought about seeing her. The prospect terrified him more than any business failure ever had. What if she looked at him with pity? What if she looked at him with nothing at all? He walked over to the safe in the corner of the study. He hadn't opened it in years. He spun the dial, the mechanical clicks sounding loud in the quiet room. Inside, among the bonds and deeds, lay a small box. He took it out and opened it. Inside was her wedding ring. He had kept it, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps as a trophy, perhaps as a penance. He took it out, the gold cool against his palm. It felt heavy, heavier than it should be. He slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know what he would do with it, but he knew he couldn't leave it in the dark anymore. The morning progressed, the sun climbing higher, burning off the mist. Arthur began to prepare for the week, but his mind was elsewhere. Every task felt secondary to the impending event. He answered emails with terse responses. He canceled 2 lunches. His assistant, Marcus, called again to confirm the itinerary, but Arthur barely listened. "Just make sure the car is ready, Marcus," he had said. "And find out who else is on the guest list." Specifically, there was a pause on the other end. "I'll see what I can do, Arthur. But discretion is key." "I know," Arthur replied. "I just need to know what I'm walking into." He spent the rest of the day in a state of suspended animation. He wandered through the house, touching surfaces, looking at rooms that had never been used. The guest room where her mother used to stay. The nursery that had been planned but never built. He stopped at the door of the nursery. They had talked about children once early on. Before the work consumed him. Before the silence grew too loud. Maybe one day, she had said, when things settle down. But things never settled down. They only escalated. He closed the door gently, as if afraid to wake a sleeping child. The irony was not lost on him. He had built an empire for a family he had neglected. As evening approached, the shadows lengthened again, but the fear was different now. It wasn't the fear of loneliness, it was the fear of reckoning. He poured a glass of water and stood in the kitchen, looking at the photo again. He imagined her life during those 5 years. Where had she gone? What had she done? Had she been happy? The thought stung more than he expected. He wanted her to be happy, even if it wasn't with him. But he also needed to know if his absence had been the cause of her pain. The narrative of abandonment was shifting. He was beginning to see it as a retreat. She hadn't left him, she had saved herself. And maybe, just maybe, she had saved something else too. The uncertainty was a physical weight, pressing against his ribs. He went to bed early, but sleep was elusive. He lay in the dark, the ring in his pocket digging into his hip, a constant reminder of the vow he had broken. The house creaked around him, the settling of the structure sounding like whispers. He closed his eyes and saw her face, not as she was in the photo, but as she was the last time he saw her. Quiet, resigned, sad. He reached out in the dark, his hand grasping at the empty space beside him. There was nothing there, just cold sheets. He pulled his hand back and clenched it into a fist. "I'm coming, Elena," he whispered into the darkness. "I'm coming to find out the truth." The words hung in the air, a promise to the past and a challenge to the future. The weeks stretched out before him, long and fraught with tension. Every hour felt like a day. Every minute brought him closer to the gala, closer to the moment the truth would be stretching like a year until finally, the evening of the gala arrived. Arthur stood before the mirror in his dressing room, adjusting the cufflinks of his tuxedo. His reflection stared back, sharp and composed, but the eyes betrayed the turmoil churning beneath the surface. He had spent the days leading up to this moment rehearsing conversations that never happened, imagining scenarios that ranged from reconciliation to outright rejection. The gold ring sat heavy in his pocket, a secret weight against his thigh, a tangible anchor to a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He took a deep breath, smoothing the lapels of his jacket, and turned away from the mirror. There was no turning back now. The car waited outside, a sleek black silhouette against the driveway lights, ready to carry him toward the reckoning he had invited. The drive to the Sterling Hotel was a blur of city lights and silent contemplation. Arthur stared out the window, watching the world rush by, but his mind was fixed on a single point in the future. When the car pulled up to the grand entrance, the flash of cameras and the murmur of the crowd outside felt distant, like noise from another planet. He stepped out, the cool night air hitting his face, and walked through the doors into the warmth of the lobby. The venue was opulent, a testament to old money and new power. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft, golden glow over the marble floors, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh lilies. Waiters moved silently through the crowd with trays of champagne, their movements synchronized like a ballet. Arthur nodded politely to a few acquaintances who called his name, but he offered no smiles, no stops for conversation. He was a man on a mission, and the business deals that usually captivated him were nothing more than background noise tonight. He entered the main ballroom, and the sound swelled around him, a symphony of clinking glass, orchestral music, and the low hum of hundreds of conversations. It was a sea of faces, some familiar, most strangers, all masked in the polite veneer of high society. Arthur moved through the crowd, his senses heightened, scanning the room with a predator's focus. He had told himself he was ready. He had told himself he could handle whatever he found. But as he walked deeper into the hall, the confidence he had tried to cultivate in the solitude of his mansion began to fray. Every shadow seemed to hold a memory. Every laugh sounded like an echo of a time when he was happier. He stopped near a large pillar, gripping a glass of champagne he didn't intend to drink, and let his eyes sweep the room again. He needed to see her. He needed to know if the woman in the photograph still existed, or if she had been replaced by a stranger. And then he saw her. Time seemed to stutter, the rhythm of the room falling out of sync for a single, suspended heartbeat. She was standing on the far side of the ballroom, near the large windows that overlooked the city skyline. Arthur's breath caught in his throat, a sharp intake of air that felt like swallowing glass. It was Elena. There was no mistake. But it was not the Elena he had remembered. The woman in his memories was soft, often tired, her eyes clouded with the worry of managing a home while he managed the world. She had worn her vulnerability like a second skin. But the woman standing by the window wore confidence like a crown. She was dressed in a gown of simple, elegant blue silk that draped perfectly over her frame, devoid of flashy sequins or ostentatious jewelry. She didn't need them. Her presence commanded the space around her without her saying a word. People glanced in her direction, drawn by an invisible gravity, but she remained focused on something outside the window, her profile sharp and serene. Arthur felt his feet move before he consciously decided to walk. He navigated through the crowd, his eyes locked on her, unable to look away. As he drew closer, the details sharpened. Her hair was styled differently, swept back, to reveal the strong line of her neck. She held herself with a posture he had never seen before, shoulders back, chin high. She looked peaceful. She looked powerful. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She had not just survived without him. She had thrived. The narrative of the fragile wife who couldn't handle his life crumbled instantly. She hadn't broken under the pressure. She had shed the pressure when she left him. A mix of admiration and profound shame washed over him. He had assumed her silence was weakness. Now, seeing her standing there, radiant and self-possessed, he understood it had been strength. He stopped a few yards away, hidden partially by a group of laughing investors. He couldn't bring himself to step into the light just yet. He needed a moment to breathe, to steady the hammering of his heart. He watched as a waiter approached her, offering a drink. She smiled politely, declining with a gentle shake of her head. The smile was different too. It didn't reach her eyes with the desperate hope he remembered from their later years. It was a closed smile, polite but guarded. She was protecting something. Arthur's hand drifted to his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the ring. What right did he have to interrupt this peace? He was a ghost from a past she had clearly outgrown. Yet the pull was irresistible. He needed to know how she had done it. He needed to know if there was any space left for him in the world she had built. "Arthur?" A voice broke his trance. It was Marcus, appearing at his elbow with a look of concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Are you all right? You've been staring at that spot for 5 minutes." Arthur blinked, tearing his eyes away from Elena for a fraction of a second. "I'm fine," he said, his voice sounding rough to his own ears. He cleared his throat, just taking it in. Marcus followed his gaze, his expression shifting to understanding. "She's here," he stated quietly, not a question. "I heard rumors, but I didn't want to say anything until you saw for yourself. She looks well." "She looks better than well," Arthur whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. He turned back to look at her. She had turned away from the window now and was speaking to a woman in a red dress. She laughed at something the woman said, a genuine sound that carried across the distance, light and clear. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years. The sound of her unburdened joy. It pierced him deeper than any anger could have. He realized then that his absence hadn't destroyed her. His presence had been the weight she needed to lift to find this lightness. The guilt was a cold stone in his stomach. "I should go to her," Arthur said, more to himself than to Marcus. He straightened his tie, a nervous habit he thought he had broken. "Wait," Marcus cautioned, placing a hand on his arm. "Give her a moment. She hasn't seen you yet. Let her finish that conversation. If you rush in now, it looks like an ambush. You want her to see you on her terms, not yours." Arthur hesitated, the logic warring with his impulse. He knew Marcus was right. He had spent 5 years making decisions for both of them, assuming he knew best. If he wanted to change the narrative, he had to start by respecting her space. He nodded slowly, stepping back into the shadow of the pillar. He would wait. He would watch. He would let her come to him. Or he would find a moment when the air between them was clear. The music swelled, a waltz beginning to play, couples moving onto the dance floor. Elena remained standing, a still point in the turning world. Arthur watched the way the light caught the side of her face, illuminating the calmness in her expression. She was no longer the woman who waited by the phone. She was the woman who had hung up and walked away. And as he stood there, hidden in the crowd, Arthur realized that the hardest part of the night wasn't going to be seeing her. It was going to be accepting that the man she needed him to be 5 years ago was not the man standing here today. He had to become someone new, someone worthy of the woman she had become. The suspense of the moment stretched tight, a wire ready to sing. He took a sip of the champagne, the bubbles sharp on his tongue, and prepared himself for the walk across the room. The distance between them was only 20 feet, but 20 feet of distance that felt like a chasm. He had rehearsed the opening line 1,000 times in the solitude of his car. "Hello, Elena. It's been too long." Simple, neutral, safe. But as he moved through the throng of guests, the air around him seemed to thicken, resisting his progress. The music, previously a background hum, grew louder, the strings swelling with a dramatic tension that matched the pounding of his heart against his ribs. He kept his eyes fixed on her silhouette against the window, a beacon in the sea of formal wear. He was halfway there when the dynamic of the scene shifted. From the side entrance of the ballroom, near the grand staircase, 2 small figures emerged. They were not alone. A nanny stood discreetly behind them, but the children moved with a freedom that suggested they were expected. Arthur slowed his pace, his instinct telling him to pause, to observe before interfering. The children, a boy and a girl, looked to be about 5 years old. They were dressed identically in miniature formal wear, the boy in a tiny tuxedo and the girl in a white dress that matched the elegance of the room without mimicking the adults. They ran toward Elena, their movements synchronized, a mirror image of energy and joy. Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. The breath left his lungs as if he had been struck. Elena turned at the sound of their footsteps, her entire demeanor transforming instantly. The guarded posture she had held while speaking to the woman in red dissolved into pure, unadulterated warmth. She knelt down, ignoring the risk to her silk gown, and opened her arms. The children collided with her, a tangle of limbs and laughter. Arthur watched frozen as Elena hugged them tightly, closing her eyes for a moment, burying her face in the crook of the girl's neck. It was a moment of intimacy so profound, so private, that Arthur felt like an intruder merely witnessing it. But it was not the affection that stopped his heart, it was the resemblance. Even from this distance, under the soft glow of the chandeliers, Arthur could see the features. The boy had Elena's dark hair, but the shape of his jaw was unmistakable. It was the same jawline Arthur saw in the mirror every morning when he shaved. The girl had Elena's eyes, but the way she tilted her head when she laughed was a mannerism Arthur's own mother had possessed. The math began to calculate itself in his mind, ruthless and immediate. 5 years since the divorce. 5 years since she left. Children who were 5 years old. The coincidence was too perfect, too cruel, too hopeful to be random. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he had to reach out and steady himself against the back of a velvet chair. He stood there, hidden partially by a large floral arrangement of white lilies, unable to move forward or backward. He was a statue in a museum of his own making. He watched them stand up, Elena holding their hands, linking them together. She said something to them, her voice carrying softly over the music. "Did you see the lights? They look like stars, don't they?" Her voice was gentle, filled with a patience Arthur remembered her having years ago, before the stress of his absence had worn it away. The boy nodded vigorously, pointing at the chandelier. "Can we touch them?" he asked, his voice clear and bright. Elena laughed, a sound that was purely maternal. "Maybe one day, but for now we just look. Remember what we talked about? We look with our eyes, not our hands." Arthur listened mesmerized. The interaction was normal, wholesome, yet it felt alien to him. He had no part in this routine. He did not know what they had talked about. He did not know what rules she had set. He was a stranger to his own potential children. The pain of that realization was sharp, a physical sting behind his eyes. But as he watched, his businessman's eye, trained to notice details others missed, began to pick up on other things. He looked at the children's clothing again. The boys' shoes were not off the rack. They were custom leather, polished to a high shine, the stitching impeccable. The girl had a hair clip in her hair, simple but glinting with what looked like genuine sapphires, not glass. Elena's own dress, he noticed now, was not just elegant. It was couture tailored perfectly to her form, the fabric flowing like water. This observation sparked a new confusion, one that battled with the emotional shock. For 5 years, Arthur had operated under the assumption that Elena had struggled. He had heard whispers that she had waived the settlement to make a clean break, that she had moved to a smaller city, that she was starting over from nothing. He had told himself that her silence was due to pride, that she didn't want his charity. He had even felt a twisted sense of guilt that she might be suffering because of his absence. But looking at them now, the narrative didn't fit. This was not the appearance of a woman struggling to make ends meet. This was discreet, quiet wealth. Not the flashy, ostentatious wealth he was used to displaying, but the kind that spoke of stability and success earned on her own terms. How? The question burned in his mind. She had waived the settlement. She had no access to his accounts. Had she remarried? The thought brought a surge of jealousy, so potent it tasted like bile. He scanned the room again, looking for a man who might fit the role, a husband who stood in the shadows. But there was no one. She was here with the children and a nanny. She was the center of their universe. Arthur's hand went to his pocket again, touching the ring. If she had moved on, if she had built this life without him, what was he doing here? Was he merely a ghost haunting a happy memory? Arthur? Marcus's voice came from behind him, low and urgent. Arthur hadn't realized his assistant had followed him. He turned slightly, his face pale. Marcus followed his gaze, and his eyes widened as he took in the scene by the window. "Oh," Marcus breathed, the sound escaping like a deflated balloon. "I didn't know about the children. The intelligence report didn't mention that." "Children," Arthur repeated, the word feeling heavy and foreign on his tongue. "Twins. They look." Marcus started, then stopped, realizing the sensitivity of the observation. "They look like you, Arthur." Arthur didn't respond. He couldn't. He turned back to watch Elena. She was wiping something off the boy's cheek, a mother's instinctive care. She looked content. She looked complete. And that was the hardest thing to witness. He had assumed that without him, she would be incomplete. He had built his empire on the foundation that he was the provider, the protector, the essential piece of the puzzle. Seeing her here, radiant and capable, surrounded by life that he had missed, shattered that foundation. He realized then that the abandonment he had felt for 5 years might have been a projection. Perhaps he was the one who had been left behind, not because she walked away, but because he had never truly been there to begin with. The luxury of their attire nagged at him again. It was a contradiction that demanded an answer. If she wasn't struggling, why had she let him believe she was? Or had he just assumed it because he couldn't imagine her succeeding without his help? The arrogance of that thought made him sick. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated her resilience, her capability, her worth. He watched as the girl took Elena's hand and pointed toward the entrance where Arthur stood. For a fleeting second, Arthur thought the child had seen him. His heart jumped into his throat. But the girl's gaze swept past him, looking at the decorations above. Elena followed the child's gaze, and for a moment, her eyes scanned the room. They passed over the floral arrangement, over the shadows where Arthur stood. He held his breath, waiting for her eyes to lock with his. Waiting for the recognition, the shock, the anger. But her gaze moved on, settling back on her children. She hadn't seen him yet. Or perhaps she had, and she was choosing to ignore him. The uncertainty was a torture worse than rejection. Arthur stepped back, retreating further into the shadows of the pillar. He couldn't approach them now. Not like this. Not while he was reeling from the discovery of their existence. He needed to understand. He needed to know how she had afforded this life, why she had kept them from him, and if there was any place for him in this picture that had been painted without his consent. "Marcus," Arthur said, his voice low, barely audible over the music. "I need you to find out everything. Not just about her business. About them. About the children. Quietly. No one can know I asked." "Arthur," Marcus warned, his voice cautious. "If she finds out you're investigating her." "She won't find out," Arthur interrupted, his eyes still fixed on Elena as she began to lead the children toward the tables. "Just do it. I need to know the truth before I speak to her. I can't walk in there blind again. I won't make that mistake twice." Marcus nodded slowly, sensing the shift in Arthur's demeanor. This was no longer about a business merger or a social obligation. This was personal in a way Marcus had never seen. "I'll make some calls," Marcus said, slipping away into the crowd. Arthur remained where he was, leaning against the pillar for support. The room seemed to spin slightly. He watched Elena seat the children at a table near the front. She tucked the girl's dress in, she smoothed the boy's jacket. Every movement was deliberate, filled with love. Arthur felt a tear prick the corner of his eye, hot and unwelcome. He wiped it away quickly, checking to see if anyone had noticed. He was Arthur Sterling, the tycoon, the man who built the skyline. He did not cry in public. But inside, the man was breaking. He had spent 5 years building walls to keep the pain out, only to find that the life he wanted most was living on the other side of those walls, thriving without him. The music changed to a slower tempo. Couples began to move to the dance floor. Arthur watched Elena sitting at the table, talking to the children, showing them the menu. She looked up again, scanning the room. This time, her eyes lingered longer. She was looking for someone. Arthur stiffened. Was she looking for him? Or was she looking for someone else? The suspense tightened around his chest like a vice. He knew he couldn't hide forever. The moment of confrontation was inevitable. But now, with the knowledge of the twins burning in his mind, the stakes had changed. It wasn't just about ex-lovers meeting again. It was about a father meeting his children. It was about a man asking for forgiveness for time he could never get back. He pushed himself off the pillar, straightening his jacket. The confusion about the money, the shock of the children, the pain of the missed years, it all coalesced into a single resolve. He would not run this time. He would not hide behind assistants or phone calls. He had walked into this room looking for a business deal, but he was leaving with a mission. He watched Elena laugh at something the boy said, her head thrown back slightly. He memorized the sound. He memorized the scene. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs. Arthur's feet moved across the polished floor, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the marble beneath him was turning to quicksand. He had intended to walk straight to the table, to stand before her and demand the answers that were screaming in his mind. But as he drew within 10 feet of their table, something instinctive halted him. A predator's caution, or perhaps a coward's hesitation. He stopped behind a large arrangement of white orchids, the blooms towering above his head, providing a fragile screen between him and the scene unfolding before him. He told himself it was strategic. He needed to understand the landscape before he engaged. But in truth, he was afraid. Afraid that if he stepped into the light, the illusion would shatter, or worse, that he would be rejected instantly. From this vantage point, partially obscured by the delicate petals, Arthur could see the details he had missed from afar. The ballroom lights caught the subtle textures of their clothing, revealing a level of quality that went beyond mere expense. It was bespoke. It was intentional. He focused on the boy first. The child was swinging his legs slightly under the table, the hem of his trousers rising just enough to reveal the ankle of a shoe. It was not the shiny, patent leather of a rental tuxedo. It was matte, soft leather, stitched with a precision that spoke of a craftsman's hand. Arthur knew shoes. He had built buildings on the backs of materials just like this. Those shoes cost more than a monthly salary for the waiters circulating the room. On the boy's wrist, barely visible as he reached for a glass of water, was a watch. It was small, simple, but the face glowed with the luminescence of high-grade material. It was a child's watch, yet it was an heirloom piece. Arthur's gaze shifted to the girl. She was playing with a napkin, folding it into intricate shapes. In her hair, securing a neat braid, was a clip. From this distance, it looked like silver, but as she turned her head, the light caught the stone embedded in the center. It wasn't cubic zirconia. It was a sapphire, deep blue and flawless, set in platinum. It was a piece of jewelry that Arthur would have gifted to a board member's wife, not a 5-year-old girl. And Elena. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her dress was silk, yes, but the cut was specific, designed by a house that did not advertise. Her clutch on the table was leather, worn soft with use but cared for meticulously. There was no logo screaming for attention. No flash. Just quiet, undeniable power. The confusion began to swirl in his gut, mixing with the champagne he had drunk earlier to form a nauseating cocktail. He remembered the divorce papers. He remembered them vividly because he had signed them in a rush to get back to a conference call. Elena had waived the spousal support. She had waived the claim on the vacation properties. She had taken only her personal belongings and a small lump sum that barely covered a year of living expenses in this city. He had felt magnanimous then. He had thought he was letting her go with dignity, assuming she would struggle and eventually come back, or perhaps fade into obscurity. He He had prepared himself to be the safety net she would eventually need. He had waited for the call that never came. So where did this come from? The question looped in his mind, relentless. Had she remarried? Was there a husband hidden in the shadows, a man who provided this life for her? The thought brought a surge of possessiveness that surprised him. He had no right to feel it. He had let her go. He had chosen the office over the home. But seeing the evidence of her prosperity, evidence that contradicted every assumption he had made for 5 years, made him feel foolish. Had she been hiding this from him? Or had he simply been too blind to see it? He remembered Marcus's words on the phone earlier. Rumors. What rumors? That she was successful? That she had moved on? Why hadn't anyone told him? Because he was Arthur Sterling, and no one dared bring him personal news unless it affected the stock price. He was surrounded by people, yet he was the last to know the truth about his own family. He watched as Elena poured water for the girl. Her movements were graceful, unhurried. She wasn't checking a phone. She wasn't looking around the room for networking opportunities. She was entirely present with them. Arthur realized with a sting of jealousy that he had never seen her this relaxed when they were married. Back then, she had always been waiting for him to come home, waiting for him to answer the phone, waiting for him to notice her. Now, she wasn't waiting for anyone. She was complete. The children were laughing at something she whispered, their faces lit up with a joy that seemed to radiate outward, warming the cold air around Arthur's hiding spot. He felt like an intruder in a sanctuary. He was the ghost of Christmas past, haunting a future he had no part in building. The luxury of their attire was not just about money. It was about stability. It spoke of a life where needs were anticipated before they were voiced. It spoke of a mother who had the resources to protect her children from the harshness of the world. Arthur had always believed that only he could provide that. He had built his empire on the premise that without him, they would be vulnerable. Seeing them here, safe and adorned in quiet wealth, dismantled his core identity. If he wasn't the provider, who was he? The question hung in the air, unanswered. He leaned against the cold stone of the pillar behind the orchids, needing the support. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his cufflink. He watched the boy point at a passing waiter carrying a tray of desserts. Elena shook her head gently, smiling. Later, she mouthed. The boy nodded, accepting the boundary without fuss. They had discipline. They had structure. Things Arthur had tried to enforce with employees, but had failed to maintain at home. How had she done it alone? Or was she not alone? The mystery of the funding was a lock, and he needed the key. If she had found someone else, someone who could give her this life, then his return was even more complicated. But if she had done it herself, if she had built this from nothing after waiving his money, then she was stronger than he had ever given her credit for. The realization was humbling. It stripped away the last of his arrogance. He had pitted her for years. He had told himself he was the victim of her abandonment. But looking at her now, he wondered if she had been the one saving herself from him. A waiter passed close to Arthur's hiding spot, interrupting his reverie. Arthur straightened up, smoothing his jacket, trying to look like he belonged in the shadows rather than hiding in them. He checked his watch. Marcus had been gone for 10 minutes. 10 minutes that felt like an eternity. He needed information. He couldn't confront her with questions about money in the middle of a gala, not with the children present. It would be inappropriate. It would be aggressive. He needed to know the landscape. Was there a husband? A business partner? A secret inheritance? The variables were too many. If he walked up there now and asked the wrong question, he could lose the chance to ever know them. The children. His children. The word still felt foreign, yet it resonated in his bones. He observed Elena again. She was wiping a crumb from the girl's cheek. The tenderness in the gesture made Arthur's throat tighten. He remembered doing that once years ago, before the work took over. He remembered the feeling of being needed. He had traded that feeling for power, for recognition, for the skyline that loomed outside the window. And now the power felt useless. He couldn't buy his way into this moment. He couldn't acquire this feeling through a merger. It had to be given, and he had no guarantee she would give it. The suspense of the situation was a physical weight on his chest. He wanted to step out. He wanted to say hello. But the discrepancy in her financial status held him back. It was a clue that something fundamental was missing from his understanding of the last 5 years. He saw Marcus emerge from the crowd on the far side of the room. The assistant caught Arthur's eye and gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. Not yet. Or perhaps it's complicated. Arthur nodded slightly, acknowledging the signal. He would wait. He would watch. He needed to see more. He needed to see if a man would join them. He stayed behind the orchids, becoming part of the decor, a statue of a man watching life happen without him. The music swelled, a crescendo of violins that matched the tension in his body. He saw Elena laugh again, throwing her head back. The sound reached him, faint but clear. It was a sound of freedom. And Arthur realized with a sinking heart that if he wanted to be part of this world, he wouldn't be able to bring his money or his name. He would have to bring himself. And he wasn't sure if the man he was today was enough for the woman she had become. The confusion remained, a fog around his heart, but the curiosity was burning brighter. He had to know the truth. He had to know how she had risen while he had remained stagnant in his grief. He shifted his weight, ready to move, ready to act, but for against his ribs. He didn't speak. He just looked at Marcus, demanding the truth with a gaze that had intimidated boardrooms into silence. But here, in the dim light behind the flowers, the intimidation felt hollow. "I have the information, Arthur," Marcus whispered, his voice low enough to be swallowed by the swell of the orchestra. He didn't hand over the tablet immediately. He hesitated, glancing toward the table where Elena sat with the children. "You need to prepare yourself. It's not what we assumed." Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "Tell me," he said, his voice rough. "Is there a husband? A partner? Who is funding this?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "No husband. No record of remarriage. No hidden trust funds from your settlement. She waived everything, Arthur. Exactly like the papers said." Arthur frowned, the confusion deepening into frustration. "Then explain this." He gestured vaguely toward the table, toward the sapphire clip in the girl's hair, the tailored suit on the boy. "This doesn't come from nothing. She walked away with barely enough to rent an apartment. I know the figures. I signed them. She didn't stay with nothing," Marcus replied, finally lowering the tablet so Arthur could see the screen. It displayed a profile, professional and sleek. She went back to school, immediately after the divorce. Environmental science and corporate sustainability. She started a consultancy firm 3 years ago, Vance Green Solutions. Arthur stared at the screen. The name was hers, but the logo was unfamiliar. He scrolled through the summary with a trembling finger. Major corporations listed as clients. Awards for innovation. Speeches given at international summits. The figures listed under her net worth were substantial. Not his level, perhaps, but more than enough to afford the life she was living. She hadn't been saved by a new man. She had saved herself. "She built this," Arthur whispered, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. While you were building towers," Marcus finished gently. "She was building a future. She's highly respected in her field, Arthur. People say she's one of the best in the city. She didn't hide this. It's public record. But you stopped looking." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Arthur lowered the tablet, his hand dropping to his side. He leaned back against the pillar, the cold stone seeping through his jacket, grounding him as the world tilted. He had spent 5 years believing he was the protagonist of a tragedy, the man abandoned by a wife who couldn't handle his success. He had worn his loneliness like a badge of honor, telling himself that she was out there struggling, perhaps regretting her choice, perhaps waiting for him to swoop in and fix things. It was a narrative. That fed his ego. It made him the hero of his own story. But the truth was far more devastating. She hadn't been struggling. She had been thriving. She hadn't been waiting. She had been working. While he sat in his mansion mourning a loss he had engineered, she had been out in the world creating something real. Something sustainable. The irony was bitter. He built structures that scraped the sky, concrete and steel that dominated the landscape. She built systems that preserved life, that looked toward the future. He had thought his way was the only way to succeed. He had thought money was the only currency that mattered. He looked at her again, really looked at her, through the lens of this new knowledge. The confidence he had seen earlier wasn't a mask. It was earned. The calmness in her eyes wasn't resignation. It was competence. She didn't need him to protect her. She didn't need him to provide for her. The realization stripped him bare. If she didn't need his money, and she hadn't needed his protection, what did she need from him? Did she need him at all? The thought was terrifying. For years, he had defined his worth by what he could give. Now, he had nothing to offer that she hadn't already acquired on her own. "Are the children?" Arthur started, his voice failing him. He couldn't bring himself to finish the question. "Biologically yours," Marcus confirmed softly. The timelines match. She hasn't listed a father on their public records, but the ages align with your separation. She kept them from you, Arthur. That's the only part that doesn't fit the profile of a woman who values transparency. Arthur nodded slowly. That was the wound that still bled. The secrecy. Why hide them? Was it punishment? Or was it protection? He looked at the boy, who was now showing his sister a trick with a spoon, balancing it on his finger. They were brilliant. They were alive. They were his. And he had missed everything. The first steps. The first words. The first day of school. He had missed it all because he had been too busy signing contracts to answer a phone call. She didn't want them caught in your orbit, Marcus said, reading Arthur's silence. Not when you were so focused on work. She probably thought you wouldn't have time, or that you'd treat them like assets. The words stung because they were true. Arthur remembered planning his life 5 years ago. Children were a variable he hadn't accounted for. They were a distraction he had postponed indefinitely. Elena had known him better than he knew himself. She had seen the path he was on and had chosen to step off it before she was dragged down with him. She hadn't abandoned him. She had evacuated the sinking ship. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, letting the noise of the gala fade into a dull roar. He felt a profound sense of shame, hot and prickling under his skin. He had judged her for leaving. He had judged her for surviving. He had judged her for everything, when the only person worthy of judgment was the man standing behind the orchids. He had let his ambition consume his humanity, and now he was reaping the harvest. What do I do, Marcus? Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of his own making. I can't just walk over there and talk about business. I can't buy my way into this. No, Marcus agreed. You can't. This isn't a merger, Arthur. This is a family, and you're the outsider. The label hit him hard. Outsider. In his own life. With his own children. He opened his eyes and looked at Elena again. She was laughing at something the boy said, her hand resting on his shoulder. The connection between them was visible, a tangible bond of love and trust. Arthur wanted that. He wanted it with a desperation that frightened him. But he knew he couldn't demand it. He couldn't command it. He had to earn it. And he had to start by acknowledging the truth. She's not a victim, Arthur said, more to himself than to Marcus. I treated her like one. I told myself she was struggling so I could feel like the hero. And now? Marcus asked. Now, Arthur said, straightening his spine, pushing off the pillar. The movement was decisive. The confusion was still there, the pain was still there, but the clarity was sharper. Now I have to treat her like the woman she is. Not the wife I lost. Not the mother of my children. Just Elena, the woman who built a life without me. He handed the tablet back to Marcus. Keep this. I don't need to read anymore. I know enough. Arthur, Marcus warned softly. If you go over there, there's no going back. You can't hide behind the orchids anymore. I know, Arthur replied. He adjusted his cuffs, checking his reflection in the dark glass of the window beside him. He looked tired, but he looked present. I've been hiding for 5 years. I think it's time I showed up. He took a step out from behind the flowers. The light of the ballroom hit him fully, exposing him to the room, to her, to the truth. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a man walking onto a stage without a script. But he kept walking. He couldn't fix the past. He couldn't change the fact that she had succeeded without him. But he could change the future. He could stop being the man who watched from the shadows. As he walked, the noise of the room seemed to fade again, narrowing his world down to the few feet between him and the table. He saw Elena look up. She sensed him before she saw him. Her eyes met his across the room. There was no shock this time. No gasp. Just a stillness. She had known he was there. She had probably known all night. The realization made his steps falter for a second, but he didn't stop. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. Arthur placed his hand in his pocket, his fingers brushing the ring again. He didn't take it out. Not yet. This wasn't about proposing. It wasn't about claiming. It was about acknowledging. He reached the edge of the table. The children looked up, curious, their eyes wide and bright. Elena stood up slowly. She didn't smile, but she didn't turn away. She stood tall, matching his height even though she was shorter. She was ready. Arthur, she said. Her voice was calm, steady. It wasn't the voice of a woman begging for mercy. It was the voice of a woman granting an audience. Elena, he replied. His voice cracked slightly, but he held her gaze. You look well. I am, she said simply. We are. The words were a boundary. We, her, and the children. A unit he was not yet part of. Arthur nodded, accepting the boundary. He wouldn't cross it without permission. Not this time. He had spent 5 years assuming he knew what was best for her. He would spend the rest of his life learning what was actually best for them. The suspense of the moment hung heavy, but for the first time in years, Arthur didn't feel the need to control it. He just felt the weight of the truth, and he was finally strong enough to carry it. He pulled out a chair, not for himself, but gesturing to the space beside them. "May I?" he asked. It wasn't a demand. It was of a life lived in parallel lines that had finally intersected. Arthur stood there, his hand still hovering near the empty chair, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched Elena's face, searching for any flicker of the warmth he remembered, any crack in the porcelain mask she wore. The ballroom noise seemed to recede, the orchestra fading into a dull hum, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the soft clink of a spoon against a crystal glass somewhere in the distance. Elena did not answer immediately. She looked at him, her eyes dark and unreadable, reflecting the chandelier light above. She studied him not as a former husband, but as a variable in an equation she had long since solved. Arthur felt exposed under her gaze. He was used to being the one who evaluated, who judged, who decided. Now he was the one being weighed. He felt the urge to speak, to fill the silence with explanations, with excuses about the merger, about the pressure, about the things he thought mattered. But the words died in his throat. He remembered Marcus's report. She had built an empire of her own. She didn't need his excuses. She needed his honesty. Finally, she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "You may sit," she said, her voice level. "But only for a moment. The children have a schedule." Arthur exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He pulled the chair out and sat, the movement stiff, mechanical. He felt like an imposter in his own tuxedo. As he settled, he became acutely aware of the proximity. He could smell her perfume again. It was the same scent she had worn 5 years ago, sandalwood and jasmine, but now it smelled different. It smelled independent. It smelled like a woman who bought her own flowers. He placed his hands on the table, clasping them together to hide the tremor in his fingers. The children watched him with open curiosity. They didn't know him. To them, he was just a man in a suit who had appeared out of nowhere. The boy, who had the same jawline as Arthur, tilted his head. "Are you a friend of Mom's?" he asked. The innocence of the question struck Arthur like a physical blow. A friend. He was less than a father. He was a stranger. Arthur looked at Elena, seeking guidance, but she remained silent, letting him navigate the minefield. He turned back to the boy, forcing a smile that felt brittle on his face. "I'm an old friend," Arthur said, the lie tasting bitter. "My name is Arthur." "I'm Leo," the boy said, pointing to himself, then to the girl. "This is Mia. We're twins." "Twins," Arthur repeated, the word feeling heavy on his tongue. He looked at Mia. She was quieter, observing him with intelligent eyes. She reached out and touched the cuff of his jacket, feeling the fabric. "You're shiny," she observed. Arthur chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. "Yes, I suppose I am." He wanted to reach out, to touch their hands, to confirm they were real, but he stopped himself. He didn't have the right. Not yet. The restraint cost him more than any business negotiation ever had. He sat there, hands clenched under the table, feeling the vast chasm between them. He was a tycoon, a man who could buy buildings, but he couldn't buy this moment. He couldn't purchase the right to be called Dad. The internal conflict began to rise, a tide of shame and pride battling for dominance. His pride screamed at him to assert his authority, to remind them who he was, to demand the recognition he felt was owed to him. He was their father. Biologically, legally, surely he had rights. But the shame drowned out the pride. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, and saw the lines of strength around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She had done this. She had raised them. She had protected them. From what? From him. The realization was a cold knife in his gut. He had thought she abandoned him. He had told himself she walked away because she couldn't handle his success. But sitting here, seeing the stability she had created, he understood the truth. She hadn't abandoned him. She had removed them from his chaos. "You look well, Arthur," Elena said, breaking the silence. She picked up her water glass, her hand steady. "Successful as always." "And you," Arthur replied, his voice rough. "Marcus told me about your company, Vance Green Solutions. It's impressive. It keeps us busy, she said modestly, but there was a hint of pride in her tone. It was her achievement, not his. It allows me to be here for them. That's what matters. The emphasis on here stung. She was here, physically present, something he had rarely been. Arthur looked down at the tablecloth, unable to meet her eyes. I thought, he started, then stopped. He wanted to say, I thought you were struggling. He wanted to say, I thought you needed me. But saying it aloud would make him sound arrogant. It would confirm everything she had probably suspected about him. You thought what? Elena asked softly. She wasn't angry. That was the worst part. If she were angry, there would be passion. There would be a connection. But she was calm. She was detached. I thought. Arthur swallowed hard, forcing the words out. I thought you left because I was working too much. I thought you couldn't handle the life I was building for us. Elena set her glass down. The sound was sharp in the quiet space between them. You were building a life for yourself, Arthur. Not for us. There's a difference. The truth of it landed with the force of a gavel strike. Arthur flinched. He wanted to argue, to list the hours he had worked, the deals he had closed, the money he had earned. All for the house they lived in. All for the security they enjoyed. But security wasn't love. Money wasn't presence. He remembered the nights he came home late, expecting her to be awake, expecting her to understand. He remembered the mornings he left before she woke up. He had assumed his provision was enough. He had assumed his love was implied in the paycheck. I didn't know, Arthur whispered. I didn't see it. No, Elena agreed. You didn't. You were looking at the horizon, Arthur. You were always looking at the next deal, the next tower. You never looked down at what was right in front of you. She glanced at the children, who were now quietly coloring on a napkin with crayons a waiter had provided. When I told you I was pregnant, you were in Tokyo. When I told you I was lonely, you sent me flowers. When I told you I was leaving, you sent a lawyer. Each sentence was a brick in a wall he had built himself. Arthur felt the heat rising in his cheeks. He wanted to defend himself, to say he was trying to give them the best. But what was the best if he wasn't there to share it? He looked at Leo and Mia. They were 5. He had missed the first 5 years of their lives. He had missed the first steps, the first words, the first nightmares. He had missed everything because he was too busy building a legacy for them to inherit. But what was a legacy without a family to share it? It was just a monument to ego. I'm sorry, Arthur said. The words felt inadequate, tiny against the magnitude of his absence. I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to know that I didn't know. I thought you left me. I didn't realize I had already lost you. Elena's expression softened, just a fraction. The hardness in her eyes melted slightly, revealing the exhaustion beneath. I didn't leave to hurt you, Arthur. I left to save them. And to save myself. I couldn't breathe in that house. It was too big. Too quiet. You were never there. It was just me and the echo of your footsteps. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment. He could see the house now, not as a palace, but as a cage. He had trapped her in gold and silence. He had assumed his presence was a gift, when in reality, his absence was a burden. The conflict within him raged. The old Arthur, the tycoon, wanted to fix this with a gesture. A trust fund. A new house. A grand gesture. But the new Arthur, the man sitting in this chair feeling small, knew that wouldn't work. She didn't need his money. She needed his time. She needed him to see her. What do you want from me, Elena? Arthur asked, his voice barely audible. I know I have no right to ask. But I'm here. I know about them. I can't just walk away again. I don't know what I want, Elena admitted, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. I protected them from the uncertainty. From the disappointment. You are unpredictable, Arthur. When you love, you consume. When you work, you disappear. I couldn't risk them becoming just another item on your schedule. The accusation was fair. Arthur nodded slowly. I can change. Everyone says that, Elena replied, her gaze sharpening again. But habits are like concrete, Arthur. They set hard. I need to see it. Not hear it. See it. Arthur looked at the children again. Leo was showing Mia a drawing of a house. It was crooked, with a big sun in the corner. It was perfect. Arthur felt a surge of love so strong it nearly doubled him over. It was painful. It was desperate. He wanted to be in that drawing. He wanted to be the stick figure standing next to Elena. I'll prove it, Arthur said. However long it takes. However you want to do it. I'm not going anywhere. Elena studied him for a long moment. The orchestra began a new piece, a slow, melancholy melody that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. She looked at the children, then back at Arthur. "Okay," she said softly. "One step at a time. No grand gestures. No press releases. Just you. If you can be just you, without the suit, without the company, without the expectations, then maybe." It was a chance. A sliver of hope. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He nodded, unable to speak. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the ring again. He didn't take it out. It wasn't time for that. This wasn't about winning her back. It was about earning the right to be a father. He pulled his hand out empty. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Elena said, standing up. She smoothed her dress. "It's time for them to go. The nanny is waiting." Arthur stood up immediately, instinctively pulling the chair back for her. It was a small gesture, but it was one of service, not command. Elena noticed. She paused, looking at him. "Next week," she said. "There's a park near their school. Saturday morning. 10 o'clock. If you're there, we can talk. If you're not, then we know where you stand." "I'll be there," Arthur promised. "I'll be there." Elena nodded once. She placed a hand on Leo's shoulder and another on Mia's. "Say goodbye," she prompted gently. "Bye, Arthur," Leo said, waving a crayon-stained hand. "Bye," Mia echoed shyly. "Goodbye," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. He watched them turn and walk away, Elena guiding them through the crowd. He didn't follow. He didn't try to trail them. He respected the boundary. He stood by the table, alone again, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of anticipation. He looked down at the table. The napkin the children had drawn on was left behind. He picked it up carefully, treating it like a sacred text. The crooked house. The big sun. He folded the napkin and placed it in his breast pocket, over his heart. He turned and walked out of the ballroom, ignoring the greetings of the investors, the handshakes of the partners. He had a business to run, empire to manage. But none of it mattered like this. He walked out into the cool night air, the city lights blurring through the moisture in his eyes. He had spent 5 years building a monument to his own success. Now he had to build a bridge to his family. It would be harder than any skyscraper. It would require a foundation of humility, of patience, of presence. He got into the car, the leather seat cold against his back. He told the driver the address of his home, but he knew he wouldn't be staying there long. He had a park to visit next Saturday. He had a promise to keep. And for the first time in 5 years, Arthur Sterling had a goal that money couldn't buy. He leaned back, closing his eyes. The image of the crooked house burned into his mind. The conflict was still there, ahead. He watched her disappear through the archway leading to the foyer, the sea of guests swallowing her blue silk dress until she was gone. The noise of the gala rushed back in, the laughter and clinking glasses sounding suddenly hollow, like noise from a television left on in an empty room. He knew he should stay. He knew he should network, should smile at the investors who were already approaching his table, sensing the vacuum left by his distraction. But he couldn't. The conversation at the table had been public, guarded, performed for the children. There were things unsaid, things that hung in the air between them like smoke, and he couldn't leave them there. He stood up, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He ignored the hand extended by a senior partner, offering a brief, apologetic nod that was more reflex than intention. He moved toward the archway, his steps purposeful but not hurried. He wasn't chasing her, he was seeking closure. He needed to know if the permission she had granted, the park meeting next Saturday, was real or merely a polite dismissal to end the scene. He stepped out of the ballroom and into the corridor. The change in atmosphere was immediate. The warmth and music were muffled here, replaced by the cool stillness of the hotel's private halls. The lighting was dimmer, casting long shadows against the wallpapered walls. It was quiet, save for the distant hum of the service elevators. He saw her ahead, standing near a large potted fern that separated the main foyer from the private restrooms and exit doors. The nanny was already ushering the children toward the exit, their small voices fading down the hall. Elena stood alone, her back to him, looking out a window at the rainy night. She hadn't seen him yet. Arthur slowed his pace, the sound of his shoes on the carpet silenced by the thick pile. He stopped a few feet behind her. He didn't want to startle her, but he couldn't let her leave without one more exchange. This wasn't about the business merger. This wasn't about the society pages. This was about the 5 years of silence that had just been broken. "Elena," he said. His voice was low, barely disturbing the air, but she stiffened instantly. She didn't turn around immediately. She took a breath, her shoulders rising and falling beneath the silk, composing herself before facing him. When she finally turned, her expression was calm, but her eyes were alert, guarded. She crossed her arms loosely over her chest, a subtle barrier. "Arthur," she said, "I thought we said what needed to be said at the table." "We did," Arthur replied, stepping closer but stopping respectfully outside her personal space. In front of them. I didn't want them to hear the rest." "The rest?" Elena asked, her eyebrow arching slightly. "What rest is there? You know about them. You know where I am. You have the meeting on Saturday. That is the boundary. Arthur, don't cross it tonight." "I'm not trying to cross it," Arthur said, holding up his hands slightly, palms open. I need to understand something. For myself. So I don't walk into that park next week with the wrong expectations." Elena studied him, the silence stretching between them. The corridor felt like a tunnel, isolating them from the world they had both built separately. "Ask," she said simply. "The money," Arthur said, the words slipping out before he could check them. He saw her eyes narrow slightly, and he rushed to clarify. "Not because I care about the money, but because I built my life on the idea that I was the provider. That without me you would struggle. Finding out you didn't, finding out you thrived. It changes everything I thought I knew about us. About me." Elena uncrossed her arms, letting them fall to her sides. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "You thought I needed you to survive," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "I thought I was protecting you," Arthur corrected, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought the work was for us. I didn't realize it was replacing us." "It wasn't just the work, Arthur," Elena said, her voice softening but retaining its steel. "It was the priority. Every time I needed you, the work was more important. So I stopped needing you. I learned to fix the leak myself. I learned to pay the bills myself. I learned to be happy myself. And then I realized I could do more than just be happy. I could build something. Vance Green Solutions isn't just a hobby. It's my proof that I exist outside of your shadow." Arthur felt the words land like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of his defenses. He had expected anger. He had expected bitterness. But this was something worse, indifference to his justification. She didn't hate him for working. She had simply outgrown the need for him to work for her. "I see that now," Arthur whispered. "I see that I underestimated you. I treated you like part of the assets I was managing, not like a partner." "And the children," Elena added, her voice dropping lower. "They are not assets, Arthur. They are not heirs to be molded. They are people. They don't know you. To them, you are a stranger who smells like expensive cologne and looks sad. If you come to that park on Saturday, you are not coming as a tycoon. You are coming as a man who wants to know his son and daughter. Can you do that? Can you put the phone away? Can you put the ego away?" Arthur looked down at his hands. He thought about the phone in his pocket, buzzing constantly with notifications he had been ignoring all night. He thought about the Skyline deal waiting for his signature on Monday. Then he thought about the crooked house drawn on the napkin over his heart. "I can," he said, looking her in the eye. "I don't know how yet, but I can learn. I have to." Elena searched his face, looking for the lie. She had known him for 10 years. She knew how to spot the mask slipping. For the first time that night, she saw something raw behind his eyes. It wasn't the polished confidence of the boardroom. It was the fear of a man who realized he might have lost the only thing that mattered. She saw the exhaustion in the lines around his mouth, the tremor in his hands that he was trying to hide. "Okay," she said softly. "I believe you. For now." "Thank you," Arthur breathed. He took a half step forward, then stopped. He wanted to reach out, to touch her arm, to bridge the physical gap that felt so vast. But he kept his hands at his sides. "Elena, did you ever hate me? For leaving it like that?" Elena looked away, toward the window where the rain streaked the glass. "Hate is expensive, Arthur. It costs too much energy. I didn't hate you. I pitied you. You had everything, and you had nothing. I didn't want that for them. I didn't want them to learn that love is conditional on success." The honesty of it shattered him. Pity was worse than hate. Hate implied passion. Pity implied he was broken. Arthur nodded slowly, accepting the verdict. "I deserve that," he said. "I deserve all of it." "You deserve a chance to be better," Elena corrected. She pushed off the wall, signaling the end of the conversation. "But only if you do the work. Not the business work. The inner work." "I will," Arthur promised. "I'll be there Saturday. 10 o'clock. Don't be late," Elena said, a faint hint of the old familiarity returning to her voice, just for a second. They don't like waiting. And neither do I. She turned and walked toward the exit where the nanny was waiting with the children. Arthur watched her go, standing alone in the quiet corridor. He didn't follow her this time. He respected the boundary. He listened to the sound of the exit door opening and closing, the swish of the rain outside, and then the silence returned. He was alone again, but the solitude felt different. It wasn't the emptiness of the mansion. It was the quiet of a beginning. He stood there for a long time, leaning against the wall, letting the cool air soothe the heat in his chest. He reached into his pocket and touched the napkin again. It was still there. Real. He pulled it out and looked at the drawing in the dim hallway light. The crooked house. The big sun. 2 stick figures holding hands. He traced the lines with his thumb. He had spent 5 years building steel and glass monuments that would last a century. But this piece of paper, this fragile, crumpled napkin, felt more permanent than any building he had ever owned. It was a blueprint for something real. He folded it carefully and put it back. He turned and walked back toward the ballroom, but he didn't go in. He walked toward the main exit. He had no more business here tonight. The investors could wait. The deal could wait. He had a week to prepare. A week to figure out how to be a father. A week to learn how to be a man who could stand beside Elena without casting a shadow over her. He pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the rain. He didn't call for the car immediately. He stood on the valet stand, letting the rain dampen his hair, his suit, his shoulders. He needed to feel it. He needed to feel something real. The cold water ran down his face, mixing with the tears he finally allowed to fall. He wiped them because he had to negotiate with his own history. He had to dismantle the man he had become to make space for the father he needed to be. The days passed in a blur of forced stillness. Arthur canceled 3 major meetings. He turned off his phone for hours at a time, a feat that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He sat in his study, not working, just thinking. He replayed the conversation in the corridor over and over. You were unreachable. The words haunted him. He remembered the months of Elena's pregnancy now, through the fog of his own ambition. He remembered the missed calls. He remembered the voicemails he listened to while driving to airports, promising to call back later, a later that never came. He had told himself he was securing their future. He had told himself the stress was temporary. But for her, it had been permanent. He had built a wall of availability around himself, accessible only to those who could profit him, and he had locked out the people who loved him. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp chill, the sky a pale, clear blue that promised no rain. Arthur woke before his alarm. He showered, dressed not in a suit, but in dark trousers and a simple sweater. He looked in the mirror. The man staring back looked tired, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet apprehension. He drove to the park Elena had specified. It was a public space, neutral ground, surrounded by trees shedding their autumn leaves. He arrived at 9:45, 15 minutes early. He parked the car and walked to the designated bench near the playground. He sat down, his hands clasped between his knees, watching the empty swings sway in the breeze. Every minute felt like an hour. He checked his watch. 9:55. 10 o'clock. She arrived at 10:02. She walked through the gate, the children running ahead of her toward the sandbox. She wore jeans and a warm coat, her hair tied back. She looked approachable, yet distant. Arthur stood up as she approached. He didn't offer a hand, he just nodded. Elena sat on the far end of the bench, leaving space between them. She watched the children. Leo was building a tower, Mia was digging a hole. They were safe. They were happy. You came, Elena said, her eyes fixed on the sandbox. I said I would, Arthur replied. His voice sounded rough in the quiet air. I meant it. I know, she said. She turned to look at him then. Her expression was serious, stripped of the gala's glamour. That's why we need to talk. Before they come over. Before they get ideas. Arthur nodded. I have questions, Elena. I know I have no right, but I need to understand. Why? Why did you keep them from me? Was it punishment? Elena sighed, pulling her coat tighter around herself. She looked down at her hands, then out at the trees. Punishment implies I wanted to hurt you, Arthur. I didn't. I wanted to protect them. She paused, gathering her words. Do you remember the second trimester? When I was sick every day. When I needed someone to drive me to the appointments because I couldn't stand the smell of the subway. Arthur flinched. He remembered. He had been in London. Closing a deal. I sent a car, he said weakly. You sent a driver, Elena corrected. A stranger. I called you 3 times that week. You didn't answer. The 4th time, your assistant told me you were in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. I was sitting in a clinic, alone, scared, carrying your children, and you were unavailable. The memory hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. He remembered that week. He remembered the stress. He remembered thinking the deal was too big to fail. He hadn't realized that something else was failing. I didn't know it was that bad, he whispered. You didn't ask, Elena said, her voice steady but laced with pain. And when I realized that even when I was right there screaming for help, you were somewhere else. I knew I couldn't bring them into that. I couldn't bring them into a life where their father was a voice on a voicemail, where their existence was an interruption to your work. Arthur looked at his hands. They were shaking slightly. I thought I was providing for them. You were providing for a legacy, Elena said sharply. Not for them. There is a difference. A legacy is something you leave behind. A family is something you live with. I needed stability, Arthur. Emotional stability. And you were chaotic. You were brilliant and successful and powerful. But you were not present. And when they were born, I looked at them, and I saw how fragile they were. I couldn't risk them waiting for you the way I did. I couldn't risk them feeling the way I felt. The honesty was brutal. It stripped away every excuse he had prepared. He had thought she was being malicious, keeping them secret out. Of spite, but she had been acting as a shield. She had seen the void inside him, the emptiness that his success couldn't fill, and she had decided her children would not fall into it. She had chosen silence over disappointment. I didn't know, Arthur said again, the words feeling insufficient. I didn't realize I was inaccessible. You were unreachable, Elena clarified. There is a difference. You were physically there sometimes. But emotionally, you were gone. During the pregnancy, I needed a partner. I got a provider. And when I realized that was all I was going to get, I made a choice. I chose to raise them without the uncertainty of you. It was better for them to have a mother who was fully present than a father who was partially there. Arthur felt a tear slip down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. I missed everything, he said, his voice breaking. The first steps. The first words. The first time they got sick. I missed it all because I was chasing something that doesn't matter. It matters to you, Elena said softly. And I respect that. But it couldn't be the only thing. Not for them. She turned to face him fully. I didn't hide them to punish you, Arthur. I hid them because I needed to be sure that if you ever came back into their lives, it would be because you wanted them, not because you wanted to add them to your portfolio. I needed to know you could be stable, that you could choose them over a meeting. Arthur looked at the children. Leo was showing Mia his tower. They were laughing. The sound was pure, unburdened. I want them, Arthur said, his voice firm despite the emotion. I don't care about the portfolio. I care about them. I know I can't change the past. I know I can't buy back those 5 years. But I want to be there now. However you let me. Elena watched him for a long moment. The wind rustled the leaves above them, scattering gold and red across the grass. Then you have to understand the boundary, she said. You don't get to sweep in and be the hero. You don't get to buy them toys or promise them trips to distract them from your absence. You have to be consistent. If you say you'll be here, you are here. If you say you'll call, you call. No excuses. No assistance. No business emergencies. I understand, Arthur said. No excuses. And, Elena added, her voice hardening slightly, you have to accept that they might not love you immediately. They might not want you. They have a life. They have a routine. You are the variable. You have to earn their trust. And you have to earn mine. Again, Arthur nodded slowly. I know. I'm not expecting anything. I want the chance to try. Elena looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of the woman he had married. The woman who had believed in him before the world changed him. Okay, she said. You can stay. For an hour. Play with them. But let them lead. Don't try to teach them. Don't try to impress them. Just be with them. Arthur stood up. His legs felt weak, but he steadied himself. Thank you, Elena, for telling me the truth, even though it hurts. It needed to hurt, she said, standing up as well. Pain means you're feeling it, and feeling it means you're finally present. She walked toward the sandbox, calling the children's names. Leo, Mia, come say hello properly. Arthur watched her walk away. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool autumn air. He felt lighter somehow. The truth was heavy, but it was solid. He could build on solid ground. He walked toward the sandbox, his steps slow, deliberate. He was not a tycoon today. He was not a CEO. He was just a man who had missed 5 years, hoping to salvage the next one. He knelt down in the sand, ignoring the dirt on his trousers. He looked at the children, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Hi," Arthur said softly. "Can I build with you?" Leo looked at Mia, then back at Arthur. He held out a plastic shovel. "You can dig," Leo said seriously. "But don't knock the tower over." "I won't," Arthur promised. He took the shovel. His hand trembled slightly as he touched the plastic handle. It was the most important tool he had ever held. He began to dig, the sand shifting under his hands, real and tangible. He wasn't building a skyscraper. He was building a moment. And for the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling was exactly where he needed to be. The wind blew through the trees, carrying the sounds of the city, but here in million-dollar contracts, yet infinitely heavier in significance. Arthur dug into the cool, damp sand, the grains shifting around the blade with a soft scratching sound. He kept his movements slow, deliberate, mirroring the cautious rhythm of the children beside him. Leo was focused on the moat surrounding his tower, his tongue poking out slightly from the corner of his mouth in concentration. Mia was sifting sand through her fingers, letting it cascade down in a golden stream. Arthur watched them from the corner of his eye, afraid that if he looked directly at them for too long, they might vanish like a mirage. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant city exhaust. But here, in this small enclosure, the world felt contained, safe. He piled sand next to Leo's moat, reinforcing the wall without being asked. It was a small contribution, a silent offer of help. Leo glanced at the added sand, then up at Arthur. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and unfiltered. There was no pretense in a child's gaze, no social lubricant to smooth over the awkwardness of the situation. Arthur felt exposed under that scrutiny. He was a man who commanded boardrooms with a glance, but here, kneeling in the dirt, he felt utterly powerless. He was waiting for judgment, and he knew he deserved whatever verdict they delivered. "Who are you?" Leo asked suddenly. The question was simple, direct, cutting through the quiet hum of the park. He didn't stop digging, but his eyes remained fixed on Arthur's face. Arthur froze. The shovel hovered midair. He had expected this, yet hearing it aloud made his throat tighten. He looked toward the bench where Elena sat. She was watching them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't intervene. She had told him to be honest. She had told him to earn their trust. This was the first test. He lowered the shovel slowly, resting it on his knee, and turned his body slightly to face the boy fully. "My name is Arthur," he said, his voice soft, careful not to startle them. I'm a friend of your mom's." It was the answer they had agreed upon in the car, the safe answer. But Leo tilted his head, unconvinced. He dropped his shovel into the sand and leaned forward, his knees knocking against Arthur's arm. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through Arthur's system. Warmth. Life. Connection. "Mom has lots of friends," Leo said, his brow furrowing. "But you look different. You look like me." Arthur's breath hitched. The observation was innocent, devoid of malice, but it struck the core of the secret they had been keeping. He glanced at Elena again. She stood up from the bench and walked toward them, her steps slow on the grass. She knew this moment was coming. She knew she couldn't shield them from the truth forever. She stopped at the edge of the sandbox, looking down at them. "Leo is right," Elena said, her voice gentle but clear. She knelt down beside Arthur, closing the triangle between them. The sand brushed against her jeans, but she didn't seem to care. "You do look like him." Mia stopped sifting the sand. She looked from her mother to Arthur, her eyes wide. Is he our dad?" The word hung in the air, suspended like dust motes in a sunbeam. Dad. Arthur had heard the word thousands of times in his life. Employees called him boss, partners called him sir, friends called him Arthur. But no one had ever called him dad. Not really. Not in a way that mattered. The sound of it coming from her, small and curious, broke something open in his chest. He felt a surge of emotion so powerful he had to grip the edge of the sandbox to steady himself. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to shout it. But he looked at Elena. This was her moment to confirm. Elena took a deep breath. She reached out and placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, then another on Leo's. "Yes," she said softly. "This is Arthur. He is your father." The silence that followed was profound. Arthur watched their faces, searching for rejection, for fear, for anger. Instead, he saw curiosity. Mia blinked, processing the information. She looked at Arthur's hands, then at her own. "We have the same hands," she whispered, holding them up. Arthur looked down. She was right. The shape of the fingers, the width of the palm. It was a biological truth made visible. He turned his hand over, palm up, an offering. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "We do." Mia reached out and placed her small hand in his. Her skin was soft, warm, trusting. Arthur closed his fingers gently around hers, afraid to squeeze too hard, afraid to let go. It was the first time he had ever held his daughter's hand. The sensation was overwhelming, a current of love so pure it made his eyes burn. He looked up at Elena, seeking permission to feel this joy, and she gave him a small, watery smile. She was letting him in. "Why weren't you here?" Leo asked. The question wasn't angry, just factual. He was trying to fit this new piece into the puzzle of his life. "If you're our dad, why didn't you come to my birthday?" The question hit Arthur like a physical blow. He flinched, the pain visible on his face. He couldn't lie to them. Not now. Not after coming this far. He looked at Elena, who nodded slightly, giving him the space to answer. He took a breath, steadying his voice. "I made a mistake, Leo," Arthur said, looking the boy in the eye. I was very busy working. I thought work was the most important thing. But I was wrong. I should have been here. I'm sorry I wasn't there for your birthday." Leo studied him for a moment, his expression serious beyond his years. He seemed to be weighing the apology. "Mom says sorry means you won't do it again," he said. Arthur nodded solemnly. "I promise I won't make that mistake again. I want to be here now. If you'll let me." Mia tugged on his hand. "Can you come to school?" she asked. "We have a show next week. Mom comes. Can you come too?" Arthur felt his heart swell. It was a small invitation, insignificant to the world, but to him, it was everything. It was a door opening. He looked at Elena, checking silently. She gave a subtle nod. "I would love to come," Arthur said. "I wouldn't miss it." Leo went back to his tower, seemingly satisfied with the answer for now. The tension in his small shoulders relaxed. "Okay," he said. "You can put the flag on top. But be careful." Arthur picked up the small plastic flag Leo offered. He placed it gently on the highest peak of the sandcastle. His hand shook slightly, but he steadied it. "There," he said. "It's safe." Mia leaned against his arm, resting her head on his sleeve. Arthur stopped breathing for a second, terrified to move and disturb.